The wind howls over the Ross ice shelf like a wounded animal, a shriek that ricochets off walls of cobalt blue ice and disappears into a sky so blank it feels like an erased page. Hidden beneath that sterile horizon lies a cavern that should not exist, a cathedral of frozen stone first mapped by a French cartographer whose name was redacted from the official expedition logs in 1840. The map survived only because his widow stitched the parchment into the lining of her eldest son's overcoat, smuggling it out of Toulon the morning the Admiralty seized every scrap of his estate. Across 2 centuries, the document changed hands in back-alley auctions, private collections, and one murder in Prague involving a Rothschild banker who bid too aggressively on items that carried Napoleon's personal seal. The final transaction occurred in a New Orleans curio shop, where an archivist pried apart the brittle seams and found a single phrase inked in trembling script: "L'armée de glace, toujours prête à marcher." No one understood what that meant until the satellite anomaly of July 12, 2017. A commercial weatherbird, looping the Antarctic coast on a routine orbit, registered a perfectly rectangular heat signature 65 feet below the Defect Massif, an impossible reading in a region that never rises above -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermal bloom stretched for 3 miles in precise geometric patterns that resembled regimental formations, complete with supply depot clusters and what appeared to be artillery emplacements carved into the bedrock. 3 frames later, the anomaly vanished. Yet the data packet pinged a server farm in Reston, Virginia, where an analyst with security clearance above the president's pay grade flagged it and typed one curious term into a classified search bar: Frozen Legion. Within an hour, a black aircraft touched down at McMurdo, offloading a squad whose insignia no historian could place, an eagle clutching both laurel and lightning, crowned by a bicorn hat that cast shadows in directions the sun never shone. They descended through a borehole drilled by lasers that carved through ice like butter, not the grinding augers that leave telltale spiral marks. At 63 meters, they struck a vault of basalt carved with imperial bees and the letter N, each glyph rhymed in hoarfrost that tried and failed to obscure the gilded relief beneath. The craftsmanship belonged to no known Antarctic civilization, because no such civilization should have existed. Yet the stonework bore tool marks consistent with 19th century French masonry, complete with chisel signatures that matched those found in the Arc de Triomphe's hidden foundation chambers. Inside lay rows of sarcophagi fashioned from a metal that predated aluminum yet weighed half as much as steel, arranged in perfect parade formation that extended beyond the reach of industrial floodlights. Every lid bore a name etched in Old Guard script: Ney, Marat, Lan, Davout, and dozens more held by ghosts the official record swears died at Waterloo or long before. One casket, larger than the rest and positioned at the formation's head, displayed no name, only a cipher, a serpent devouring its own tail, intertwined with the Latin motto, Ultima Ratio Regum. When the agents breached that central tomb, their helmet cams showed a man who looked merely asleep, not dead. Hair still black despite 2 centuries of interment, hands folded over a ceremonial sword whose blade gleamed with an oily sheen that defied metallurgical analysis. His uniform remained pristine, save for a film of crystalline frost that sublimated when exposed to body heat, revealing fabric woven with gold thread arranged in patterns that resembled circuitry more than decoration. His chest neither rose nor fell, but thermal sensors read a pulse, a periodic ignition deep within the tissues, as though every cell waited for a distant bugle call that had yet to sound. Bloodwork taken on site revealed nanoscopic shards of hexagonal ice, arranged in lattice patterns that refracted light into fractals. Each shard bore microscopic engravings of troop formations, artillery schematics, and coordinates stretching from Toulon to Moscow to a blank quadrant farther south than any known landmass had ever been charted. The ice shards were not natural formations. Laboratory analysis revealed traces of mercury, lead, and an unknown crystalline compound that occurred nowhere else on Earth, except in samples recovered from meteorites that struck Siberia during the winter of 1812. The same winter Napoleon retreated from Moscow when eyewitnesses reported stars falling like tears from heaven's eye and strange auroras that twisted into tricolor patterns across the northern sky. Those celestial phenomena coincided with Napoleon's most cryptic dispatches to his marshals, orders written in a cipher that remained unbroken until 2019, when quantum computers finally decoded his references to stellar iron and the cold forge that shapes eternity. Historians once laughed at Napoleon's letters referencing Ma Terra Nova, a rumored continent he insisted the Templars kept off every map despite their dissolution 5 centuries earlier. But the emperor was a mathematician before he became a conqueror, trained in the École Militaire's most advanced geometries, and possessed of a mind that calculated trajectories in 4 dimensions, while his contemporaries struggled with 3. His private notebooks, seized by the British at St. Helena and held in Whitehall vaults until 1994, contained detailed calculations predicting a land bridge buried beneath shifting polar sheets, a bridge he intended not merely to discover, but to reinforce with permanent installations that could outlast the rise and fall of empires. During the 1812 retreat from Russia, a supply convoy vanished with 300 wagons loaded with equipment that contemporary technology could not possibly have produced. Steam-driven borers capable of penetrating permafrost, pressure suits woven from copper-infused fabric that conducted heat while repelling moisture, and crates stamped with the seal of the Parisian Académie des Sciences, containing instruments whose purpose military engineers could not fathom. The convoy's manifest, recovered from a bombed basement in Berlin during the final days of World War II, listed materials that read like science fiction to 19th century eyes. Thermodynamic engines, portable. Electromagnetic conductors, insulated. And most puzzling of all, temporal preservation apparatus, assembled. Eyewitnesses to the convoy's passage were systematically bribed, then transferred to remote postings where their testimonies would carry no weight. The convoy's last known waypoint was Riga. Its next destination was never recorded in any official document. Yet a French brig named Aigle Noir sailed from Antwerp that winter, filed no port of call with any maritime authority, and was found decades later by whaling crews in the Weddell Sea, perfectly preserved in pack ice, with its ballast hold conspicuously empty and its crew's quarters filled with Antarctic mapping equipment that would not be invented for another century. The man in the bicorn had always played chess in 3 dimensions, while his opponents struggled to see beyond the next move. Moscow was a feint, Waterloo a calculated sacrifice designed to mask his true objective. His strategic vision extended beyond the conquest of Europe to the planet's axis, where magnetic fields warped the flow of time itself, and cold could preserve flesh and metal in states that approached suspended animation. There, according to a diary page smuggled out of Longwood House by a guard who mysteriously died in a Liverpool alley the day after his retirement, Napoleon established Legio Gelida, a regiment of volunteers selected not for their battlefield courage, but for their ability to endure an experimental procedure that 19th century medicine dismissed as madness incarnate. The volunteers were dosed with an elixir derived from Arctic lichen, mercury salts extracted from Siberian meteorites, and a third component whose chemical signature matched no known element on the periodic table. The serum slowed metabolic decay to a crawl, permitting a form of suspended animation that reduced cellular activity to barely detectable levels while maintaining neural pathways in a state of crystalline preservation. The emperor's personal physician, Dr. François Antomarchi, documented successful trials in journal entries that were confiscated immediately after Napoleon's death. Dogs frozen solid in alpine caves and revived 6 months later with full memory intact. Horses placed in induced hibernation during winter campaigns and awakened with steam rising from their nostrils, ready to charge. Most disturbing of all were the human subjects, volunteers from Napoleon's inner guard, who emerged from experimental chambers with their minds enhanced, capable of calculating artillery trajectories with supernatural precision and remembering battlefield details with photographic clarity that bordered on the supernatural. The Emperor's final journal entry before his guard was transferred to Australia, dated the day before his official death, reads like prophecy wrapped in the language of strategic planning. When Europe burns in the fires of her own making, when kings bow to merchants and nations dissolve into numbered accounts, my legion will rise from crystal halls beneath the world's crown. The banner shall unfold against a sky unclaimed by any living power, and the Grande Armée will march once more. Not for glory, not for gold, but for the restoration of an order that lesser men cannot comprehend. What Napoleon could not predict was exile to St. Helena, or perhaps he orchestrated it himself, as the final gambit in a strategy so complex it required 2 centuries to unfold. Some scholars argue the island imprisonment was no punishment, but a carefully orchestrated relay station in an elaborate escape route. From Atlantic isolation to covert rendezvous in the roaring 40s, then southward aboard a whaling vessel whose captain had been purchased with Rothschild gold and whose logs list a mysterious passenger identified only as B.O. The ship's surgeon noted peculiar demands from this enigmatic traveler: barrels of saline solution mixed with compounds that crystallized on contact with air, copper wiring arranged in geometric patterns that resembled the sacred geometry of Masonic temples, and a sealed chest that hummed with barely contained energy when touched by human hands. 7 crewmen died of hypothermia within sight of subtropical waters, their bodies discovered in the rigging with expressions of terror frozen on their faces and strange burns on their palms that resembled lightning strikes. The captain, driven to desperation by phenomena that defied rational explanation, ordered the chest thrown overboard in the middle of a calm sea. But the passenger dove after it, never resurfacing despite search efforts that continued for 3 days. The crew reported seeing impossible things during those searches: whirlpools that spiraled upward instead of down, phosphorescent lights that spelled out French military commands in the darkness, and on the final night, a figure walking across the waves toward an iceberg whose angles were too precise for nature to have carved. From the iceberg's base protruded a mast rigged with signal flags spelling one word in naval semaphore: course, the ancient name for Napoleon's birthplace, a code that meant the emperor had reached his ultimate destination and activated protocols that would remain dormant for 2 centuries. The whaling ship limped back to port with a crew driven half-mad by experiences they could not explain, carrying logbooks that maritime authorities confiscated and sealed in archives that officially do not exist. In 1958, Operation Deep Freeze drilled core samples near the coordinates where that iceberg had been sighted. Among sedimentary layers dating back millennia, scientists retrieved artifacts that should not have existed: a musket ball embedded alongside a sliver of tricolor fabric, both preserved in ice formations that contained trace elements, matching the mysterious 3rd component found in Napoleon's preservation serum. The discovery was immediately classified due to anomalous chemical composition and stored in a facility beneath NORAD where temperature fluctuations were monitored by sensors more sensitive than those used to detect nuclear weapons. The facility's existence was acknowledged only in budget line items buried so deep in defense appropriations that even congressional oversight committees never questioned the expenditures. Someone had been drilling in Antarctica before Byrd, before Shackleton, before the continent carried any name at all on civilized charts. Satellite archaeology conducted in secret during the 1980s revealed a network of perfectly circular depressions beneath the ice sheet, each exactly 30 meters in diameter, and arranged in formations that matched regimental bivouac patterns from the Napoleonic Wars. Ground-penetrating radar detected metallic anomalies at precise depths, suggesting buried caches of equipment positioned with military precision across thousands of square miles of seemingly empty wasteland. Why wait 2 centuries for activation? Because Napoleon understood that conquest is timing elevated to an art form, and premature awakening would doom his legion to defeat by forces they could not overcome. An army thawed too soon would freeze again in the gears of 19th century warfare, their advanced weapons useless against enemies who fought with muskets and bayonets. but soldiers roused into a world united by fiber optic cables and dependent on satellite constellations, systems vulnerable to precisely calibrated electromagnetic disruption, could strike like an avalanche that begins with a whisper and ends with the reshaping of mountains. The lattice embedded in each soldier's bloodstream functioned as both preservative and receiver, tuned to a frequency emitted once every 150 years when solar winds carved temporary holes in Earth's magnetosphere. That geomagnetic pulse, predicted by French astronomers working with calculations that would not be verified until the space age, was scheduled to transmit through polar ice, like a bell through crystal, shattering the crystalline stasis that held the Legion in suspended animation, and flooding their preserved veins with reanimated blood, charged with electromagnetic potential. The pulse was due on the winter solstice of 2025, a date Napoleon had calculated using star charts acquired from Templar archives and astronomical observations made during his Egyptian campaign, when he spent 3 nights alone inside the Great Pyramid's King's Chamber, conducting experiments that his staff dismissed as eccentric hobbies. Those experiments involved measurements of magnetic field variations and temporal distortions that occurred when celestial bodies aligned in configurations that repeated across centuries with clockwork precision. Footage leaked through channels that intelligence agencies cannot trace shows drones hovering over the Dufek vault like metallic vultures, their cameras recording tremors along the sarcophagi seams as though the metal breathed with barely contained life. Infrared sensors detected temperature spikes that followed the rhythm of human heartbeats, and seismic equipment registered footsteps that paced in formation despite the absence of any living beings on the surface. In one frame, an arm twitched inside its crystalline tomb. In another, a gauntleted hand flexed with the mechanical precision of a clock spring unwinding after centuries of stored tension. In the monitoring station excavated 200 feet above the burial chamber, technicians argued in French over whether to trigger the failsafe, a network of thermite charges rigged to collapse the entire cavern system and entomb the Legion permanently beneath millions of tons of Antarctic bedrock. The debate grew heated as electromagnetic readings spiked beyond the threshold programmed into automated defense systems. But the order to detonate never came. Instead, a voice crackled over an archaic field radio whose frequency had been silent since 1840. Speaking dialectal Corsican in cadences that matched voice print analysis conducted on wax cylinder recordings made during Napoleon's exile. The transmission issued coordinates corresponding to major under-ice lakes that geological surveys had dismissed as natural formations, but which now revealed themselves as components of a vast hydraulic network. Hidden waterways that could deliver an armored column beneath the Ross ice shelf and surface within tactical range of McMurdo Station's fuel depots, communication arrays, and the runway that connected Antarctica to the outside world. Each coordinate was accompanied by tactical assessments that demonstrated supernatural familiarity with modern logistics. Satellite uplink schedules, supply chain vulnerabilities, and electromagnetic frequencies that could paralyze GPS navigation across the entire southern hemisphere. The modern world assumes armies require supply lines stretching across continents, satellite intelligence updated in real time, and victory conditions measured in social media hashtags and international approval ratings. Napoleon's calculus operated according to older mathematics. Sever the head, and the body staggers regardless of its size. Strike the nervous system, and even giants collapse. Control the flow of information, and reality itself becomes malleable. Antarctica's geothermal vents could power field forges capable of repairing equipment that had been dormant for 2 centuries. Its glacial tunnels provided storage space for munitions preserved in perpetual refrigeration. Its magnetic anomalies could disrupt satellite communications across 3 continents, while leaving the Legion's crystalline network unaffected. Strike once, simultaneously at communication hubs in Christchurch, Punta Arenas, and Cape Town, and global logistics would fracture like glass struck by a hammer. Then march north under a banner that no living historian believed could ever be raised again. carried by soldiers whose lungs remembered only the smoke of imperial cannons, and whose hearts beat in rhythm with drums that had been silent since Waterloo. Last week, an oil exploration crew operating in the Scotia Sea reported a phantom flotilla, visible only on sonar and thermal imaging, silhouettes of masts and rigging beneath ice fog that refused to dissipate despite winds that should have cleared the air for miles. The vessels showed hull configurations consistent with early 19th century warships, complete with gun ports and anchor chains, but their metal hulls registered temperatures 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding water. Most disturbing were the sails. Thermal imaging revealed fabric stitched in tricolor patterns that rippled with movement, despite the absence of any wind beneath the ice. Radio contact with the exploration vessel was lost after the captain's final transmission, delivered in a voice tight with barely controlled panic. "They are signaling in semaphore, bees and thunderbolts, repeated in sequence. The flags." Christ Almighty! The flags are moving by themselves. Search planes dispatched from Argentine bases found nothing but rippling wake patterns that had frozen mid-wave, creating sculptural formations of ice that twisted toward the Antarctic night like fingers reaching for something beyond the horizon. The wake patterns spelled out letters when viewed from sufficient altitude. VIVE, LEMPEREUR. Repeated across miles of frozen sea, in script so precise it could only have been carved by minds trained in military engineering and possessed of equipment that defied contemporary understanding. Satellite photography confirmed the formations remained visible for exactly 24 hours before natural forces erased them, but not before intelligence analysts noted their resemblance to semaphore signals used by the Grande Armée during the Russian campaign. McMurdo Station's runway lights began flickering intermittently 3 days after the Scotia Sea incident. Each failure traced to power outages whose cause technicians could not determine despite exhaustive diagnostics of every electrical system on the base. The failures followed patterns that resembled Morse code when plotted on a timeline, spelling out coordinates that led to supply caches buried beneath the ice at depths that required specialized drilling equipment to reach. Each cache contained the same inventory: antique military uniforms pressed beneath layers of dry ice, boots that left no tracks in snow despite their obvious weight, and ammunition cartridges stamped with dates from 1815, yet filled with a powder that burned electric blue and left residue that glowed for hours after detonation. The uniforms were tailored to fit men whose measurements matched personnel records from Napoleon's Imperial Guard, complete with personal effects that should have been buried with their original owners 2 centuries earlier. Pocket watches engraved with battle honors, miniature portraits of wives and children whose descendants could be traced through French genealogical records, and letters written in hands that graphology experts confirmed belonged to men officially killed at Waterloo. Most unsettling were the orders folded inside each uniform's breast pocket, deployment instructions written in cipher that decoded to reveal detailed knowledge of modern Antarctic operations, including security protocols that had been classified above top secret and changed only weeks before the discovery. Somewhere in the labyrinth beneath the Dufek Massif, a bicorn hat tilted as eyelids fluttered open for the first time since cannon smoke drifted across a Belgian field on June 18, 1815. Ice crystals crackled off gold epaulettes as a hand closed around the hilt of a sword that had never been surrendered, its blade inscribed with a prophecy forged in the furnace of imperial ambition. La glace cède à la volonté. The ice yields to will. Across the Southern Ocean, weather stations recorded barometric anomalies, forming concentric rings that marched outward from the Antarctic coast like drumbeats made visible on atmospheric pressure charts. Seismographs misinterpreted the rhythm as tectonic unrest, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who had studied Napoleonic battlefield cadence. 1 beat for artillery preparation, 2 for infantry advance, 3 for cavalry charge. the old choreography of empire rehearsed beneath a sky where auroras twisted into tricolor ribbons that spelled out regimental numbers in languages that officially died with their last native speakers. The drumbeats were not metaphorical. Hydrophones deployed by marine research stations detected rhythmic impacts transmitted through the ocean floor, each pulse timed with the precision of a metronome and originating from points beneath the ice sheet where geological surveys showed no possible source of seismic activity. The sound traveled faster than physics allowed, suggesting transmission through materials denser than rock or ice. Materials that matched the composition of the mysterious metal used in the sarcophagi, substances that could conduct both sound and electromagnetic energy with supernatural efficiency. On December 21, the winter solstice, the sun would set over Antarctica and not rise again for months, plunging the polar plateau into an unbroken night that provided perfect cover for operations that required absolute darkness. It was not coincidence that Napoleon had chosen this date for activation. His Egyptian studies had revealed the solstice's significance to ancient civilizations that understood time as a spiral rather than a straight line. Cultures that had built monuments designed to focus celestial energies at moments when the boundary between dimensions grew thin. The first microwave relay tower went dark at 11:47 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on December 20. Its failure cascading through communication networks in a pattern that intelligence analysts would later recognize as following the route Napoleon had planned for his march on Moscow. GPS satellites began experiencing glitches that caused navigation errors across the southern hemisphere, with deviation patterns that spelled out French military commands when plotted on polar projection maps. Magnetic compasses spun like dancers in a waltz choreographed 200 years ago, their needles pointing not toward magnetic north, but toward coordinates buried beneath Antarctic ice. While governments convened emergency sessions and scientists scrambled to explain phenomena that challenged every established law of physics, listen closely to the wind over the Ross ice shelf. Beneath its howling, you may detect something that should not exist. The distant cadence of boots crisp on ancient snow, the low thunder of cannon wheels groaning awake after a slumber far colder and far shorter than eternity itself. The frozen legion stirs in its crystal halls, and the emperor's greatest gambit begins its final phase in a war that was never truly ended, only postponed until the stars aligned and the ice remembered how to yield to an iron will that death itself could not break.